You're standing with the crowd just outside Jerusalem. Dust in the air, the city's stones warm in the sun. And Jesus calm, unhurried points downward. Not to some invisible pit under the earth. To a real ravine you could walk to. The Valley of Hinnom, a place with a reputation that makes parents swallow hard. You've heard the old stories. Kings who burned what should never be burned. A valley stained with shame. And now Jesus takes that place, Gehenna, and uses it as a warning. So your mind does what minds always do. It fills in the blanks. You picture what pop culture trained you to picture. A medieval cavern, black rock, endless screams, demons with hooks, people being tortured right now, forever, underground. But then the text won't let you stay there. Because Jesus doesn't say, an eternal torture chamber. The Bible doesn't hand you one single word that neatly matches the poster in your imagination. It keeps using different words, different images, different timelines, Sheol, Hades, Gehenna, and if you collapse them all into one English word, hell, you don't just lose nuance. You can end up hearing Jesus warn about one thing while the Bible is actually describing another. The valley is still there in front of you. The warning is still sharp. But the language is not what you expected. And that means something crucial has been hiding in plain sight. Most Christians have been taught to imagine hell as one thing. A single, eternal, underground torture chamber where people are being tormented right now forever. That picture is powerful. It sticks. But it's also a compression. It flattens the Bible's vocabulary into one pop culture word. And once you flatten it, you start reading scripture like it's all talking about the same place. What the Bible actually teaches is more layered and more text-driven. In the Old Testament, the most common word is Sheol. It isn't a final courtroom where God pronounces the last sentence. It's the realm of the dead, the grave, the place people go down to when life ends. Sometimes it's described with dread, sometimes with silence, but it's not the same thing as final judgment. When you move into the Greek-speaking world of the New Testament, you meet Hades. Often, it functions as the Greek counterpart to Sheol, especially in translation contexts. And here's the key. Even when Hades is described as real and fearsome, the New Testament can still speak of it being emptied, defeated, and thrown away. That's not how you talk about the final destination of evil. That's how you talk about something temporary in the storyline. Then Jesus uses a different word, Gehenna. Not an abstract underworld. A loaded symbol rooted in a real valley now turned into a prophetic image of judgment, destruction, and shame. And finally, at the Bible's climax, you don't end with a universe eternally balanced between heaven and a rival kingdom of torture. You end with resurrection, judgment, and what Revelation calls the lake of fire, tied to the second death. The finality is there, the warning is there, but the Bible's categories are not the same as the cartoon. This isn't an attempt to soften judgment. It's the opposite. It's letting Scripture speak precisely, so you fear what Jesus actually warned about, not what later imagination painted. That image you pictured at the beginning, the valley, the fire, the dread? To understand it, you have to follow the Bible's words the way the Bible uses them. And that means going deeper. Once you notice the Bible keeps switching terms, you start realizing it's tracing a story, Israel's story about death, judgment, and God's future. In Israel's scriptures, Sheol is the default destination of the dead. Not just for the wicked. For everyone. Jacob expects to go there grieving. Job speaks of it as a place where the weary are at rest. The Psalms cry from the edge of it like a man standing at the mouth of a grave. Sheol is down because burial is down. It's the realm you can't climb out of by human strength. That matters because it tells you something simple. Early biblical language about the dead is not primarily about a torture chamber. It's about death itself, its power, its finality, its silence. But Israel didn't stay isolated. Over time, Jews lived under empires, spoke other languages, and read their scriptures in Greek. And when Hebrew texts used Sheol, the Greek translation often used Hades *, a familiar Greek word for the underworld. Now, Hades in Greek culture already carried imagery. Shadows. Depth. The place of the dead. When that word gets used for Sheol, it can import associations, even if the biblical writers are still telling Israel's story. And then there's Gehenna. That's not a mythic underworld word at all. It's geography. The Valley of Hinnom, in Hebrew *Gehenna. In the Old Testament, it becomes notorious because of idolatry and child sacrifice associated with some kings of Judah, You hear it in Jeremiah's condemnations. So the valley becomes a symbol of covenant unfaithfulness and the horror of what happens when God's people imitate the nations. By the time Jesus speaks, Gehenna has become a prophetic image, like saying, "This is where rebellion leads." It's concrete enough to picture, but symbolic enough to carry eschatological weight. So when English Bibles simply print, hell, you're often missing the fact that the text is moving between grave language, underworld language, and valley of shame language. And once you see that, a question forms that won't go away. When Jesus warns about Gehenna, is he talking about the same thing the Psalms meant by Sheol, or is he aiming at something later, sharper, and final? Now the words start lighting up in passages you've read 100 times, because the Bible itself keeps giving you contextual clues. Take Sheol. In Hebrew poetry, it's paralleled to the pit and death. People go down to it. God can bring up from it. It's spoken of as a place that swallows, like the earth opening its mouth. It's not usually described as a chamber of active torment. It's described as the power of death that drags life into the dark. When the Psalms plead, they're often pleading not to be abandoned to Sheol, because that means being cut off from the land of the living. Then you step into the New Testament and meet Hades. Jesus says the gates of Hades won't prevail against his church, meaning death's realm won't win. Peter, quoting Psalm chapter 16 in Acts 2, says the Messiah wasn't abandoned to Hades. And in Revelation, Hades isn't the final prison. It's something that gives up the dead, and then it's thrown into the lake of fire. You don't throw the final destination into anything. That's the text telling you Hades is a stage in the drama, not the last scene. And then comes Gehenna, on Jesus' lips. This is where translation blurs things the most, because many English versions simply say, hell. But Jesus is doing something specific. He warns about being thrown into Gehenna. He pairs it with images of fire and destruction. He uses it in moral warnings aimed at Israel covenant people who think they're safe because of ancestry and proximity to the temple. The Greek word behind hell, there is often Gehenna, a direct borrowing of the valley's name. That should stop you, because it means Jesus is not merely talking about an invisible underground realm. He's evoking a prophetic symbol loaded with Israel's history. And alongside all of this, the New Testament speaks of resurrection, judgment, the second death, and the lake of fire. Those phrases aren't just synonyms for Sheol or Hades. They function like end-of-story language. So the map becomes clearer. Sheol is grave language. Hades is grave language in Greek dress, and it can be defeated. Gehenna is judgment language with a valley's shadow. But the hardest question is still waiting. How do these terms fit on the Bible's timeline? What happens at death? What happens at resurrection? And where does the final judgment actually land? You've separated the words. That's step one. But the real shock is the sequence when each reality appears in the story, and which one the Bible calls final. That timeline is where pop culture falls apart. And once you put the words back into the Bible's plotline, the order of events starts correcting the picture in your head. In much of the Old Testament, death is the great equalizer. People go to Sheol. That's the baseline language, the grave, the realm of the dead, the silence you don't return from by sheer will. But the storyline doesn't end there. Later biblical hope sharpens into resurrection hope, God not merely saving a soul from a place, but raising the dead and judging the world. That's why resurrection of the dead becomes central. Because the Bible's final justice requires bodies, histories, names. Not a vapor. Now watch how the New Testament places Hades. Jesus talks about the rich man and Lazarus with imagery of post-mortem reversal and anguish, and the point is unmistakable. Judgment is real. But even there, it's not the final courtroom scene of Revelation. And when Revelation does go cosmic, it uses courtroom sequence language. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them. That line is doing heavy lifting. Hades isn't the final location of the wicked or the righteous. It's a holding reality in the story, one that can be emptied. Then comes the end of story vocabulary. The lake of fire, the second death. Those phrases are not used like synonyms for Sheol. They read like verdict language. Not merely where the dead are, but what happens after judgment. Even death and Hades themselves are thrown into it. That's apocalyptic way of saying death dies. The realm that swallowed humans gets swallowed. So the timeline tightens. Death happens. The dead are kept. Judgment comes with resurrection. And the finality is expressed not as an eternal rival kingdom under God's world, but as the removal of death and evil so new creation can stand. And if that's the sequence, then Jesus' Gehenna warnings aren't random horror imagery, they're a covenant alarm aimed at where a person is headed when the whole story reaches its verdict. The Bible's hell vocabulary is not a single dungeon under the universe. It's a set of coordinates in a story. Sheol reminds you what death is, the undoing of life, the silence no one can bargain with. Hades reminds you that death's realm is real but not ultimate, not untouchable. Gehenna reminds you that God's warnings are not theater. They are covenant truths spoken into history, with a real valley's shadow clinging to every syllable. And then the end comes into view. Not a cosmos forever stabilized by an eternal torture chamber humming beneath creation, but a final judgment where God names what is true, raises what is dead, and removes what destroys. Even death itself is not allowed to be eternal. That is both more sobering and more beautiful than the cartoon. More sobering, because Jesus is not playing with metaphors. He is warning you that choices have weight, that sin is not a costume you take off at the grave, that God's holiness is not negotiable. More beautiful, because the judge is not a monster. The judge is the one who intends to heal his world by doing what no human court can do: set everything right all the way down. If this kind of text-first clarity opened something for you, if it felt like scripture snapping back into focus, there's more where that came from. Follow along by subscribing, and keep going deeper into the words that have been hiding in plain sight.